At this time, it's my pleasure to bring up Heather, who's going to introduce our guest speaker. Also, my cue has just walked in. Today, after today's meeting, if any of our veterans would like to participate in helping plan our Veterans Luncheon in November, Mr. Kuntz, the chair of that committee, is here, and he would like great participation. We want to make it full between Take Out the Wall out here in November. So after today's meeting, if you'd meet him up here at the front table for the veterans meeting. Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce Cathy Slusser. Cathy is a second-generation Floridian who grew up in St. Petersburg, but spent holidays and vacations with her grandparents who lived here in Manatee County. She moved to Teresita Island in northwest Manatee County in 1979. She fell in love with history upon reading Eugenia Price novels in middle school. When she traveled to St. Simon's Island, Georgia, and saw the places of where those characters lived, she knew that the subject of history could be alive and exciting. Ever since that time, she has made it her goal to share that message with others. She has a bachelor's degree in history from Furman University and a master's in history from the University of South Florida. She has worked for the Manatee County Clerk of Circuit Court's office since 1984 and is Director of Historical Resources. In this role, she supervises 5 historical sites: the Manatee Village Historical Park, the Manatee County Historical Records Library, and the Florida Maritime Museum, the Palmetto Historical Park, and the Manatee County Agricultural Museum. That's an awful lot. Cathy has 2 grown sons, Rob and Tim, a fabulous daughter-in-law, Miranda, and a daughter of the heart, Christina. That's very nice. She has been married to her husband, Glenn, a 3rd-generation Floridian since 1981. She enjoys horseback riding, sewing, and writing. Cathy is the author of 3 novels about Manatee County history and the, help me with that, Atzeroth, say that one more time. Atzra family, first settlers of Teresita Island, and a newly released novel about her grandmother's life in Cuba and as a secretary to a U.S. congressman in the 1920s. Cathy is passionate about preserving Manatee County's past and telling its stories to residents and visitors of all ages. Please give a warm Kiwanis welcome to Cathy Slusser.
Well, I appreciate that kind introduction, but my name is not Cathy Slusser. My name is Mary Gates, and I was born October 6th, 1816. My husband Josiah and I were the first settlers of Manatee County, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me tell you about me first. I was raised in Sylvania, Georgia. Sylvania was a lovely place to live. I thought I would live there my entire life until one day I met a young man named Josiah at a church social. Josiah was an orphan. He'd been raised by his uncle in South Carolina, but he decided he wanted to go somewhere and make a mark on the world. He wanted to start his own community, and so he was traveling through the southeastern United States looking for a place to live. Well, I thought Sylvania was the perfect place to live in. When Josiah and I fell in love, I just assumed we would stay in Sylvania. But shortly after we were married, Josiah decided we were going to move, and this time we moved to the east coast of Florida. Now, I was young and in love, and while saying goodbye to my family in Sylvania was hard, my brother Miles decided to come with us, so I took a little bit of our family, and we moved, and I was quite happy there. It was the first time I'd ever seen the Atlantic Ocean. And I was pregnant by then with what would be a son named Edward. And we were very happy making a home there. And then Josiah came home and said this wasn't where he intended to live the rest of his life, and we were moving again. This time we moved to Fort Harley. You call it Micanopy today. It was a terrible place to live. You see, the Indians from the south part of Florida were attacking the settlers in North Florida, and we were on the boundary. And in fact, we were keeping house for some of the soldiers who were stationed there. One day, Josiah was away, and the soldiers were away, and I had our son Edward, and by that time I was pregnant again, and I saw Indians coming to the house. And I knew that I had to get away, so I just picked up Edward and I ran out the back door, and I ran as hard as I could, and then I got to a fence that separated our house from our neighbors, and all of a sudden I realized, being pregnant and carrying the baby, I couldn't get over the fence. So I started screaming as loud as I could, and the neighbor came and helped me over the fence, and I stayed at their house until Josiah came home. This time, when Josiah announced we were moving again, I said, "When do we pack? Let's go." I was ready. And this time we ended up in Fort Brooke. You call it Tampa today. Fort Brooke was a lovely place to live. I loved Fort Brooke. There was so much going on. There was a school for the children and churches. There were all kinds of socials happening. We were keeping house for soldiers again. And this time we also had sea captains who would come and stay with us. Men who had sailed all around the world. They had been to Africa and Asia and California. And it was just so interesting, and I was very happy. I made some friends. And then Josiah came home and said we were moving again. This time I said, "No, I'm not going. I'm happy here. You've moved us 4 times in our marriage. Our children have been born in different places. I'm happy here. Let's just stay here. Can't we start a life here?" And Josiah said, "But Mary, I found it. I found the place that I've been dreaming of my whole life. It's called the Manatee Lands. And if you promise to come with me and see it, I know you'll be happy there. You see, the federal government is going to give us 160 acres of land for free. All we have to do is build a house and promise to live there for 5 years." 5 years? We'd never lived anywhere that long. And so I agreed to go. And when we sailed into the Manatee River, I knew exactly why Josiah wanted to live here. What a beautiful place it was. Wide, sandy beaches on each side of the river. There were alligators sunning themselves on the river, and turtles in the water, and birds in the air so thick that you could sometimes not see the sun. And manatees in the river that were so thickly swimming together, I swear you could have crossed the river on their backs. We sailed up to the end of what you call 15th Street East today, and that's where Josiah decided he would build our house. My brother Miles had come with us, and so we had a helper, and Josiah climbed up into the top of the tallest pine tree, and he carved a G. And all around that pine tree for 160 acres was our land. Josiah built a house. It was a small cabin. We built it out of pine logs, and it was called a dog trot cabin because it had a room on one side, a room on the other, and then a hall down the middle between the two. There was no door on each end of that hall so that the air could blow through. We didn't have the nice air conditioning that you have today. And we were very happy there, but around the house and what Josiah built out in back, which aggravated me. Men can be so aggravating. He built the kitchen way far away from the house because he said that I would be cooking over a fire laid down on the dirt floor, and I might put too much wood on the fire. Like I would put too much wood on the fire. But it would burn the kitchen down, and that night he wanted to make sure he had a bed to sleep in. All around these buildings, Josiah built a tall, sturdy fence. It was made out of palm trees. He sharpened off the tops just like you'd sharpen off a pencil, and he put one all the way around, and a layer all the way around, and then he put a second layer all the way around. And I said, "Josiah, why do we need such a strong, sturdy fence?" And he said, "Oh, you'll find out." I found out. One day, one of the children left the gate to the fence opening, and I was in the kitchen cooking, and I got that feeling you get sometimes when somebody's standing behind you. And as I turned around to see, it was a panther. He had smelled dinner cooking and decided to come in and help himself. And so I started screaming once again, and Miles came running, and he shot the panther right there on our kitchen floor. There was another reason we needed that fence. The same Indians that had plagued us in Fort Harley were here in Manatee. They were here because the settlers were moving farther and farther south into the southern part of Florida, and they were being pushed farther and farther down into the Everglades. In fact, that was the whole goal of the federal government. When giving away the land in Manatee, they expected us to be a layer of protection between the settlers in the north and the Indians in the south. The federal government was tired of paying for forts and soldiers, so they decided to let the settlers take care of it themselves. Of course, I didn't know that in the beginning. But all around there, we had Indians, and they often attacked. And one night, they attacked Dr. Braden's plantation. Dr. Braden lived out at the intersection of the Braden and the Manatee River. And he was at supper with the children and his wife and Major Gamble, who was a guest there. The woman who stayed upstairs with the baby called down and said, "Dr. Braden, someone's out there." And he looked out the window. He blew out all the lights so he could see better, and he saw shadows creeping along the ground. So he called out. No one answered. All he heard were the sound of shots being fired back at the house as the Indians attacked. And so he began shooting, and thankfully Major Gamble had brought his brand new repeater rifle with him, and they were able to drive the Indians away. The next morning when I heard about it, I was so frightened I went to bed with all my clothes on. Even though Josiah was boarding up the windows, I just knew they were going to come for us next. And eventually the men decided it was better if they gathered all the families into one large home, because then they would only have to protect that home. And so Dr. Branch's house was the biggest house in the community. He was intending to start a hospital for people with tuberculosis, and so we all went to stay there. There is a reason that every woman should have her own kitchen. When we were all living there together, the neighbors that I had loved and enjoyed from afar were now my roommates, and it was just very fretful, especially as the summer grew on. All of us crammed into that house. There was an epidemic of measles. Many of the children got the measles. There were 2 babies born during that time, and we were all ready to go home by the time the holidays arrived in December. So when our men said they thought it was safe enough for us to go home, we had a big celebration. We all went home, and we became friends again. I make it sound like life was hard, and it was. We had hurricanes. In 1846, all of the water blew out of the river with a hurricane, and then 2 years later, a hurricane came at the same time of the year, and this time it blew all the water into the river. I had just wallpapered my living room with beautiful red velvet wallpaper. And you can imagine as the water rose up to the second floor of our house, and I stood looking down the stairs and saw that red dye from the wallpaper turning the water like blood. It was just a really awful feeling. And it was worse because we never knew when a hurricane was going to come. We always wondered. We always maybe felt the barometric pressure change, but we never knew for sure. Life was hard. But we had some good times too. We would have corn grindings and quilting bees, and we started a school for the children, and we started a church. We called it the Union Congregation. There weren't enough people to have a separate church for the Presbyterians and the Methodists, so we all met together as one congregation. We actually only got to meet once a month because the circuit rider would only come once a month. He would go to other churches, and then he'd eventually get to our church, and we would have worship services. Life was good. I even made a friend. Her name was Ellen Clark, and Ellen and I would sometimes slip away from our husbands and children. You know, when your children are pulling on your skirts and your husbands are asking what's for dinner, and we would just go sit down in a rowboat in the middle of the river. One day, a flock of flamingos flew over so great that they blocked out the sun. I got so excited, I stood up in the rowboat and started to shout and promptly fell overboard. And fortunately, Ellen was able to pull me back into the boat. I'll never forget that day. Life was good. until 1860. And then there was a war. Some of you call it by different names, but it was the Civil War with the South fighting the northern states over a variety of reasons, and all of our men went off to fight. They left us women at home to try to keep the farms running and keep our families safe. And one day we saw a gunboat slowly cruising into the river, and we knew it was a federal gunboat, and we knew what they were there for. They were there to burn our mill, our cane mill, and our corn mills, the things that we depended upon for our livelihood and to feed our families. So we women got together and we said, we can't let them do that, and we marched down to the river. We met the captain of the gunboat, and we said, sir, you don't understand how important those mills are to us. You must leave them because our children will starve without them. And the captain said, ladies, go on home. Everything's going to be fine. And we were walking away congratulating ourselves on our bravery. And one of the children said, Mama, what's that? We turned to look, and they were burning our mill anyway. When the war was over in 1865, most all our men came home. I was very grateful that Josiah came home. I remember old crotchety Edmund Lee. He was a Presbyterian minister from Vermont. He fought on the side of the South, and when the war was over, he was still in Tennessee. And he walked all the way home. He said he wasn't taking a ride from a Yankee. We got all the way home, and life started over, and we had to rebuild. Josiah and I built a hotel, a 2-story hotel with a 30-foot front with a porch on both floors. And we were taking in visitors from around the country. Josiah wrote to newspapers and said that Manatee was a place to come and live, to be cured of diseases or to go hunting and fishing, and what a wonderful place it was. And our hotel was full most of the time. I was cooking and taking care of the guests. And then one summer in 1870, Josiah got real sick. The doctor thought it might be from the heat. And so he told Josiah that he needed to go north. So our daughter Katie went with him. They took the boat to Tampa, and then they took the train, and it went through Jacksonville on its way to North Carolina. But by the time that Josiah got to Jacksonville, he was dead. Katie brought his body home in a metal coffin, and we buried him in the Manatee burying grounds that he and I had given to the community. I thought my life was over. My whole life had been dependent upon this man, and what was I to do? A woman alone? But I still had children at home, and I had to start over. And so I continued to run the hotel. I planted the first citrus grove on the south side of the Manatee River. I watched our son Josiah Jr. grow up to become the mayor of the town of Manatee. I watched our daughters get married and have their own families. Life was good. Not as good as it had been, but it was good. And then in the year 1896, 2 days shy of my 80th birthday, I died and went to be with Josiah. I appreciate you inviting me to come today and talk to you about our community's history and the town that Josiah and I helped to build. It's amazing to see how it's come and what it is today. But I do have one favor to ask of you. If you ever meet a woman named Cathy Slusser, would you tell her I'd like to meet her too? Thank you. I understand you might have some questions, and I'll just tell you briefly that if you want to learn more about our community's history, we're part of the Clerk of Circuit Court's office, and we make it our goal to make history come alive. We understand that a lot of people think history is a boring list of the names and dates of generals or presidents, and so our goal for all of our staff is to make history come alive and to make you understand better what it was like to live here and what the value is on our community's history. If any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Mm-hmm. She asked about the town of Manatee. It was originally the village of Manatee, then later it became a town. It was located from about what we call the Braden River up to 9th Street East. A lot of people think of it as East Bradenton today, but it was its own town until 1945. During the Depression, the town of Manatee was no longer able, they went into debt because of the services that they were having to provide for the residents. And by the time that World War II was over, they were severely in debt. So they took a vote, or had a referendum, and they decided to merge with the city of Bradenton. But a lot of the residents, the longtime residents of Manatee, wore black armbands for a month as they mourned the town that they had.
How did you deal with before screen wire came along with insects?
There's a lot of debate about how the first pioneers did without screens, without air conditionings, without having any protection from the mosquitoes. A lot of historians believe that the mosquitoes and the pests were actually not as bad then because there were more natural predators. We hadn't killed off the flocks of birds and the other things that eat the mosquitoes. I'm not sure about that. I would love to go back in time for one day and ask them, but I want to come home at night and sleep in my own bed.
Cathy, could you tell us about the program from the Manatee Village on Voices?
If you enjoyed what you heard me do today, there is a program that's held at Manatee Village Historical Park in October called Voices of Old Manatee. And you can go into the old Manatee burying ground that I referenced, where Josiah Gates is buried, Mary as well, and some of their children. And they have actors who impersonate the people that are buried there and tell their story in first person, just like I did today. Tickets will be going on sale soon. If you go to Facebook, to Manatee Village Historical Park, or to their website, manateevillage.org. You can get information about buying tickets to that event. It's really a wonderful way to learn about history and to take your friends too.
The Glazier family fit in with all that history.
The Glaziers were part of that. They were part of the early pioneers that came. In fact, the church, the Union congregation that was formed, Abigail Glazier was one of the founding members. The Glaziers also came from New England. Ezekiel Glazier was a carpenter. He built Gamble Plantation. He built the first courthouse for Manatee County. He also went off to fight in the Civil War for the South. Interestingly enough, even though he didn't own a slave, and even though he was here from Connecticut, he believed strongly in what the South was fighting for. Anybody else?
It is a tradition at the Bradenton Kiwanis Club to give to you a small token of our appreciation, Mary, for everything that you've done for us and taking us back into time. This is the Kiwanis Golden Rule. It's here to help gauge your future success and the success of Manatee County in keeping our history alive. Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you so much. Many thanks again to everyone who volunteered for Christmas in August. It was a resounding success. Thank you so much for helping the children of this community, especially our most vulnerable and our most in need that needed our help, that needs our community's help. Because of you, those children are going to be able to go to school with everything that they need, and they're going to be able to feel good about it and to have a good, fresh start. Thank you again so much. God bless each and every one of you. Have a wonderful week. We are adjourned.